It's a freezing February midnight in northern France. Former enemies, French and German, meet to commemorate the bloodiest battle in history, which began on this night 75 years ago. Verdun. No civilization has succeeded in containing violence, though all have tried. Perhaps indeed war is a condition of civilization. But in history, only the West waged war all over the globe, from the conquests of the 15th century to the world wars of our own time. Under the flags of past battles, the old familiar rituals of Christian sacrifice take place. Only a lifetime ago, 750,000 people died here for a couple of square miles of ground, where the heirs to the culture of Voltaire were bled white by the heirs of Goethe and Beethoven. The pointlessness of it all passes belief today. But the history of the West, more than any other, has swung between savagery and idealism. A contradiction apparently deeply rooted in our character and history. And now in the 1990s, after centuries of conflict, the Europeans are finally moving to unite. The descendants of the Barbarians, of the Franks, Goths, Angles and Saxons, the first people in history to spread their civilization across the whole planet. In the cemeteries of the First World War, where Asians, Africans and Americans lie alongside their European brothers, we begin the last stage of this search for the origin and character of civilization. In the forests above Verdun, snow still lies on a village which ceased to exist in 1916. The battlefield of Verdun is the most poignant reminder of how a supposedly rational and humane civilization can descend to terrifying violence and irrationality, all in the name of civilization. And that brings us to that most difficult of tasks, which is to see ourselves as others see us, to see our culture as we would a foreign country. And there, the inescapable lesson of history is that for all the great achievements of the West, for all its humanistic values and its egalitarian principles, its character is touched by a deep strain of violence. And that's the paradox which confronts us as we look to the future of civilization, at a time when all across the world, the values of the West are supposed to have triumphed. We Greeks live around the sea like frogs around a pond, said Socrates. This is Samos, and here began the quest which would lead Western man to the exploration of space and the conquest of nature itself. Here for the first time, Western man speculated on the composition of the universe, observing the geometries of nature. Questioning the role of humanity in this order, the existence of God. On Samos and its neighboring coasts were born the scientists who laid the foundations of our modern view of the universe. The most famous was Pythagoras, author of the theorem we all learn at school, and in a mountain cave here, a tradition of him has still survived. It might sound like a simple folk tale, but the tradition was first recorded not long after Pythagoras' day, and it contains an important kernel of truth, that for all their brilliant qualities of mind, the Greeks had to borrow from Africa and Asia to create their civilization. In the West, we look upon this moment as the birth of science and reason. But it would be more accurate to describe it as the birth of Western science and reason. Because right across the old world at this time, around 500 BC, it was an astonishingly creative epoch. The Axis Age, the time of Confucius and Lao Tzu in China, of the Buddha and the great grammarians and philosophers in India, of the Zoroastrians, the Jewish prophets, and the philosophers and poets here in Greece, all of them grappling in their own way with the ultimate question, the nature of reality itself. Still the ultimate question, whatever your line of business, whether it's poetry, religion, or particle physics. But this was the first time that the West, Europe, had participated in these great currents of civilization emanating from Asia. And here in Samos, it's easy to see why, because that's Asia over there. It's that close. In fact, the Greek word Asia originally meant simply that coastline in front of us. So that's the beginning of the great land mass, the teeming heartland of civilization, stretching away across the Fertile Crescent to Iraq, Iran, India, and China. So not surprisingly, Pythagoras and his contemporaries had imbibed Asian ideas, Babylonian astronomy and mathematics, Indian ideas about the soul and about rebirth. They may have transformed them with their own genius, but the Greeks still shared the basic beliefs of those other civilizations, that the universe was an ordered, beautiful, and harmonious whole. In their language, a cosmos. Man is by nature a political animal, said the Greeks. The new scientific view of the world was the catalyst for a new politics, democracy. And the first democracy was Athens. Buildings of classical Athens, like the Parthenon, are monuments to that new order. Like 18th century Britain or America, Greek democracy was limited. It excluded slaves and women. But it took the essential step of putting politics into the hands of the citizens. That was what the Greeks called politismos, civilization. For the Greeks, the essential quality of civilized life was humanism. The idea that man is the measure of all things, that the fulfillment of each individual's potential was the goal of civilization. This idea permeated all the legacies in art, philosophy, and literature which the Greeks bequeathed to our modern world. In the dramatic festivals, 30,000 citizens saw these great issues of fate and freedom acted out for all to see. The Greeks understood early on that civilization is fragile, that it is a hard thing to maintain an open society, that the irrational will always threaten to burst out in human life with terrifying force, no matter how noble a society's ideals. The Greeks, said Aristotle, are intelligent and free and have the capacity to rule all mankind. And in the 4th century BC, under Aristotle's pupil, Alexander the Great, they invaded the Near East. The valley of the Nile thronged with Greek colonists. In Upper Egypt, the monuments were covered with graffiti by awestruck Greek tourists. To think, fumed an Egyptian priest, we taught these upstarts all they know. And at Luxor, in the inner shrine of the ancient Egyptian temple, striding like a pharaoh of old, is the violent golden boy of Western history, Alexander himself. Overrunning Babylonia and Persia, the Greeks now crossed the Khyber Pass and poured into India, building their colonies on the northwest frontier. Alexander's successors went further still. In the 2nd century BC, they sent devastating expeditions down the Ganges, sacking the ancient religious center at Benares. And at the little village of Kosambi is graphic evidence of the trail of destruction. Here, a Buddhist monastery has been excavated, which was swept by a Greek firestorm, torched by Greek mercenaries sweltering out here, so far from home. These were terrible times, said the Indians. The vicious but valiant Greeks ruined our land with fire and famine, killing women and children, and even our cows. Such was the first time the West went out to the world. But the Greek conquests liberated tremendous historical energies. Trade routes now open through Central Asia on the Silk Route to China. In earlier times, said the historian Polybius, the world's history had been a series of unrelated episodes. But from now on, history becomes an organic whole. The affairs of Europe and Africa are connected with those of Asia, and all events bear a relationship and contribute to a single end. Riding the monsoon winds, Greek and Roman merchants now sailed into the Indian Ocean to trade in spices. Each year, the Roman balance of payments ran millions into the red to fill the pepper barns by the river Tiber. It was the beginning of a vast exchange of cultures and ideas, the first glimmering of a world economy. The Romans had united the Mediterranean world, conquering the Iron Age cultures of Europe, along with the sophisticated city dwellers of Greece, Syria, and Egypt. Brilliant architects, engineers, and military planners. Like all empires, theirs was based on military might, on slavery and cruelty. At its height, the empire extended from Hadrian's Wall in Scotland to the Persian Gulf, and you could call yourself a citizen of Rome, whether you lived in Manchester, Athens, Luxor, or even briefly Uruk in the baking south of Iraq. But unlike India or China, there was no binding religious or social ethic to hold its disparate parts together. And in the 4th century, it entered a great crisis, economic, social, and especially spiritual. And the vacuum was filled by an obscure cult, one of many new religions arising out of the spiritual ferment of the late antique world, Christianity. In Egypt in particular, a form of Christianity developed, which would exert a profound and lasting influence on the Western mind: monasticism. Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, and with that a set of beliefs, myths and taboos deriving from the Iron Age people of Palestine and ultimately from the Bronze Age cities of Iraq was accepted by the rulers of the West as the final revelation of history. And even though the Roman Empire itself fell to the northern barbarians in 410 AD, this sense of historical mission was never lost. The triumph of Christianity was another product of the extraordinary fertility of ideas born in the intractable landscapes of Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, a testimony to the continuing inspiration which the West has drawn from the more ancient cultures to the East. Rome was sacked by the barbarians, but there's a sense in which Rome has never fallen. For Roman cultural ideals, Roman imperialism and Roman Christianity have remained the ideals of the West. And the several renaissances in Western history have been attempts at the rebirth of those ideals, right down to the moves to unite Europe taking place now in the 1990s, which perhaps will be the fruition of the old dream, symbolized in these gigantic buildings. And in that sense, all Europeans and most Americans are the heirs to this culture. But unlike China and India, which essentially remained true to themselves throughout their long histories, at this moment, the West acquired a new self. For now, the barbarians became the Romans and created a new culture, which is the true basis of ours even today. the Barbarian West.
After the fall of the Roman Empire, tribes of Germanic barbarians made their new home in the ruined provinces. Out on the wild shores of Britain, with a religion from the Near East, a monasticism from Egypt, and a written language from Italy, the Anglo-Saxons started from scratch to build their new order, with the optimism of all immigrants thrown on strange shores. The ruins of that order are still around us, silent shapers of our modern world. Here on the River Tyne in Northumbria, the searcher for that past has to travel back through many histories, through the ruins of later empires built on coal, steel, and ships. But here at Jarrow is a place as crucial as any in the Western story. To get to it now, you have to cross muddy slakes and reclaimed slag tips. Here in the monastery of St. Peter and Paul, the first great history of the West was written, which spelt out the West's view of its own destiny. The author was a monk here, the Venerable Bede. Bede was the first to use the Anno Domini system of dating history from Christ's birth, which is now used throughout the world. The books written here give clues to his time. The biblical hero David, for example, was a model for the rulers of the barbarian West. Portrayed as the teacher of his people, the psalmist, he's a reminder that the great Western tradition of social legislation and welfare comes not from Greece or Rome, or even the Victorians, but from the Dark Ages. And here's David with the spear of God waging just wars against non-believers. Put the two ideas together, and you have the ideal Western ruler from the Crusades to the Gulf War.
Bede's history was the most remarkable and the most successful attempt to show how the peoples of the barbarian West in the Dark Ages transformed themselves through the agency of civilization. Christian, Latin, Mediterranean civilization. Bede was a thoroughgoing European in that respect. In comparison with, say, contemporary Tang China, Bede's Anglo-Saxons and the people of Europe were indeed barbarians. They were impoverished, underdeveloped third world immigrants, as we would say today in the patronizing language of the rich. And yet here on the Northumbrian coast in the 8th century are already the key elements out of which the culture of the modern West would emerge. Judeo-Christian religion and ethics, the remains of Greek and Roman humanism and law, and native Germanic society and language. In the hands of a historian like Bede, that mixture could be made to tell a powerful story, that the peoples of the barbarian West were the appointed Christian heirs of the Roman Empire, a chosen people destined to lead us on into the last phase of human history, from the city of man to the city of God.
The idea that history is purposive and leads to an appointed end would become one of the driving themes of world culture, from St. Augustine to Marx, and from Jarrow to Tiananmen Square. In the medieval era, between the 11th and the 13th centuries, the barbarians came of age. They created the greatest epoch of art and architecture which the world had ever seen, the age of cathedrals. Inspired in part by Islamic forms, this was still the first full expression of a distinctively Western genius, and more than that, of the Western soul. But even during the cathedral age, social forces were at work, which would eventually loosen the hold of the Church of Rome on the former barbarians. This is Norfolk in eastern England. Here, 800 years ago, changes can be detected in ordinary people's lives which would have a crucial bearing on the future. This brings us to one of the most fascinating questions in the story of the rise of the West. How was it that such small-scale countries and economies could end up dominating the world as they've done? As late as 1550, England only had 2.5 million people. China and India, with their vast and highly developed economies, had passed 100 million centuries before. They'd made all the great inventions necessary for scientific and industrial revolutions. How had it happened? Was there something distinctive about the character of the West, or was it just historical chance? A graveyard in Norfolk may seem a strange place to ask such a question, but some answers may lie here. Because across northwestern Europe, and especially here in East Anglia, records of birth, marriage and death suggest that as early as the 12th century, a distinctive character was emerging, of late marriage, of small nuclear families, but of also a possessive, property-based individualism and a free market philosophy, which seems uncannily like the seeds of later Western ideology, of the ideology which through the English, French and American revolutions became the dominant philosophy of the West and which rules our lives even today. In parts of Western Europe, men and women were already marrying in their late 20s and having small families. So Western people were beginning to do what today's Chinese, for example, have had to enforce by law. This was the key not just to population control, but to the accumulation of wealth. For with security of life, inheritance and property, you don't need big families. It was the start of a revolution in values, which would see the West diverge from all traditional societies. The first signs of Western individualism.
Punching, good order. What's the worth? 10, 31, 10 minutes, 10, 10, 12, I got 2, 14, 16.
And individualism is the key to the Western conception of freedom. An idea which came not from ancient Athens, as we like to believe, but from here in Western Europe, from places like Norfolk, where Tom Paine was born, prophet of the American Revolution. It was an idea based on the ownership of property and freedom in the marketplace. At its heart lay individual, not collective rights.
And this idea of freedom would be an essential element in the triumph of the modern West.
Going at 13 pounds all done. Gentlemen here, 13 per
But the triumph of the modern West was only made possible by a flood of ancient learning and science from Islam. When Europe was still in the Dark Ages, the Fertile Crescent entered another glorious phase of its culture. Here in the universities and libraries of Baghdad, Babylonian astronomy, Hindu mathematics, Chinese science and technology were passed on by the Arabs. It was one of the foundations of the Western triumph.
It was one of the great multicultural epochs of all time. If one could combine Arabic faith and Jewish intelligence, said one, with an Iraqi education, Christian conduct, Greek knowledge, Indian mysticism, and a Sufi way of life, this would be the perfection of humanity. That dream still stands as one of the greatest of all declarations of faith in an international civilization.
So the West's rediscovery of its ancient science and knowledge in the Italian Renaissance was indebted to the Muslims. At the same time, it rediscovered what many since have seen as its very soul. In around 1500, in this garden in the Vatican, the Roman popes gathered ancient Greek and Roman statues, which they saw as the greatest art of all time.
And here we find another clue to the way the West has seen itself.
Starting with Michelangelo himself, Western artists were in awe of these statues for nearly 400 years, until the whole classical vision was broken down by the Impressionists and the Cubists.
The artists of the Renaissance shared with the Greeks the idea that man was set apart from all other animals by his intellect, by the use of reason, by freedom itself. And they made the human body a symbol of that ideal, naked, beautiful, and autonomous. It was a vision as distinctive of the Western way of seeing as landscape painting is of the Chinese. Indeed, it sets Western art apart from all the other artistic traditions of the world. The inspiration behind this sculpture goes back to an age like our own, the Hellenistic world of Alexander the Great. Restless, cosmopolitan, self-aware. Thrilled by illusion, fascinated by sex and violence, which they portrayed in their art with dazzling technical virtuosity and exaggerated passion, just like the late 20th century Hollywood cinema, its true heir. Freud said that the West was a culture enslaved by its own image. In the video age, that's still true, only more so. Now there comes the event on which the whole course of modern Western history rests. An event which opened unimaginable mental horizons and brought undreamed of wealth flowing back to Europe, renewing and transforming the spiritual empire of Rome, gilding its roofs with stolen gold, perhaps the greatest event in history. The conquest of the New World. From Mexico to the Andes, the Europeans appropriated the almost limitless resources of the New World, studying its landscape with the churches of their gods. With hindsight, we can see now that 1492 was a landmark for all the native peoples of the world. For it marked the beginning of a systematic war waged against them by Western arms, religion, and ideology. It marked, too, the beginning of their struggle to maintain their traditions, their beliefs and customs, their ways of seeing, against the overwhelming impact of Western culture. And 500 years on, the struggle still continues. The conquest was accompanied by a genocide unparalleled in history. In the century after Columbus, over 2/3 of the native population of the Americas died through disease and violence, perhaps as many as 50 million people. Columbus wrote to the Queen of Spain, "Our European civilization will bring light to the natives in their darkness. But for ourselves, we will gain gold. And with gold, we will be able to do what we want in the world." The discovery of the New World shifted the center of gravity of the West, away from its old heartland in the Mediterranean, to the seaboard of northwestern Europe, to nations like Holland and England, Protestant and capitalist. Here in Malden, a small port on the east coast of England, is a symbol of that age, the intact library of a 17th century scholar, Thomas Plume, who endowed the professorship of astronomy at Cambridge. And here are more clues to the way the Western view of the world was changing under the influence of individualism and of science. Plume's 7,000 books enable us to step back into the intellectual world of the new secular civilization of the West, at the very point of its rise to world dominion. Here are translations of Greek and Arab science. There's Galileo's vision of the cosmos. Descartes anatomizing the marvels of the human body. But the key figure in the new learning was Francis Bacon. For Bacon saw how science and technology would be used in the future to dispossess the other peoples of the planet and to control nature itself. Bacon now looks like the prophet of our age, stepping out on the road which would eventually lead to Hiroshima and the global warming. This new science, new learning, had fateful implications for the future, as Bacon himself understood. For if it were true, as Bacon said, that henceforth in human affairs, what was most useful in practice would also be most correct in theory, then truth itself could be defined in terms of utility, usefulness, not in terms of religion and morals. And so man could become a law unto himself, as Bacon said, and depend no more on God. It's one of the founding ideas behind our modern Western scientific civilization, which would go out and exploit and subdue the entire world in the name of that new science. Now, for Westerners, life could be seen as a series of phenomena capable of scientific explanation. The earth itself ceased to be sacred, subject now to Western definitions of space and time. Mapped on a meridian based on Greenwich. And when the Chinese were first shown a map of the whole world by the Jesuits, they were shaken by the knowledge of these so-called barbarians. Up till then, one said, they'd printed maps of the world in which China was all. But when they saw the world so large, and China only a corner of it, they knew in truth that the world had changed. The first political expression of this new knowledge took place not in Europe, but in America. Here the huge spaces and the relatively small indigenous population enabled the settler class easily to dispossess the natives and build their new society, their labor needs sustained by slaves from Africa. Jefferson, Franklin and their fellows had Bacon and Hobbes and the stars of the French Enlightenment in their libraries to justify their faith in reason and limited democracy to shape the future, to bring to all, as they hoped, certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When Jefferson and the revolutionaries of 1776 devised the Great Seal for their new republic, they put on it a motto from the imperial Roman poet Virgil, announcing a new order on earth. You can still see it today on every US dollar bill. But the new order was actually based on older ideas. It was based on the individualism that we've traced back to medieval England. It was based on the scientific ideas of Francis Bacon and his successors, rational, utilitarian, and secular. And those ideas, in the hands of limited democracies, run by the property owners and the movers of money, would become the basis of the phenomenal success of the Western powers. For power lay in the control of knowledge. It was a harbinger of the future. Hitherto, most of the great technological advances in history had come from Asia. But now the countries of Northwest Europe took over the world's trade, backed up by industrial revolution at home. And a new form of international culture was born, in which most of us still live today. Manufacturing capitalism. A system sustained by empires and the exploitation of the Third World. The industrial city has since spread across the landscape of the world, from the plains of India to the Yellow River in China. The effects on human beings, on the environment, and on the biosphere are still being counted. And now, in the 1990s, where does Western history stand? 500 years on from Columbus, the capital of the West, indeed the capital of the planet, is now in the New World, Washington, D.C. The USA is the heir to the Western barbarians of the Dark Ages, sharing their language, culture, and religion. Its monuments, Egyptian obelisks, and Greek and Roman temples proclaim it to be the inheritor of the legacy not just of Europe, but of the ancient civilizations too. And as Washington celebrated victory in the Gulf War, never in history had so much power resided in the hands of one nation. The ideals of this new order are noble ones. The Lincoln Memorial was inspired by the Parthenon in Athens. It commemorates one who through a brutal civil war held on to the ideals of the European Enlightenment, the French and American revolutions. The belief that all are born equal, with equal rights to freedom and happiness. The first state in history to offer the hope of a genuine multiracial society. But there's another side to the triumph of the West. For the 20th century has seen warfare on an unparalleled scale, fought by Western powers right across the world, from Verdun to Vietnam. And from Africa, the heartland of humanity, to Asia and the Americas, all the native cultures of the world have been turned upside down by the impact of the West, for good or ill. If our troubled time has taught us anything, it is not to believe in utopias. But if the talk of a new order is to mean anything in the next century, then perhaps we should look afresh at our history, see it as others see it, and question our collective myths and our cherished ideals. Maybe even our notion of freedom itself.
There we go. Okay. Want to put the helmet on? Good. Now, if you were flying along and all of a sudden you saw a bad guy, well, all you have to do is basically look at him and you can shoot him.
In our time, the astonishing growth of technology and communications has seen the global village arrive. As a world ideology, our own liberal democratic capitalism would seem to have no rival. And yet, throughout the countries of the rich West, there's a growing and profound disquiet. A feeling that the Western way of life itself is no longer supportable morally or practically because of pollution, environmental destruction, and the continuing exploitation of the mass of humanity. If that disquiet is justified, which surely it is, then the great question for the next generation is simple. Are the values of the West alone enough to guarantee the continuing health of the planet? Those values, as we've seen, are writ large in our history. Individualistic, competitive, acquisitive, always pushing outwards, never happy in an empty room, as Pascal said. And yet it's the bearers of that vision of life, the rulers of the West, who hold in their hands the future of the planet. It feels at this moment as if the West, at the very moment of its triumph, has reached that point which comes to all civilizations, when, if they're not to decline, they must transform themselves by learning from others. The crisis of earth and spirit we now face was caused by one form of civilization, that of the West. And now what is needed is a dialogue with the other peoples and cultures of the world, beyond anything seen before. It was India which taught long ago that the lust for possession will destroy us, and that life is sacred, all life, not just humanity. Long ago, the Chinese believed that the basis of life was finding the harmony between mankind and nature. That we must balance the needs of the individual and of society. That the individual must accept limits on space and desire in a world with finite resources. These great alternative traditions speak to us now with growing urgency at the end of our destructive century.
and they speak on behalf of the vast majority of the people of the planet. Their insights as valuable to life now as the rainforests, for these are the rainforests of the spirit. As the Sufis of Islam said, truth is one. Christian, Muslim, Hindu, black, white, yellow, the spirit is in all of us.
The goal of civilization, said the greatest of all historians, the Arab Ibn Khaldun, is settled life and the achievement of luxury. But there is a limit which cannot be overstayed. When prosperity and luxury come to a people, they're followed by excessive consumption and extravagance. With that, he says, the human soul itself is undermined, both in its worldly well-being and in its spiritual life.
There's one last journey in this search for the origins of civilization. A journey back to the starting point, to southern Iraq, to the Garden of Eden and Uruk, the first city on earth. Here, the Great Revolution happened 5,000 years ago, when people first began to live in cities. And now, Uruk is a lunar wilderness, its once fertile fields ruined by ecological catastrophe.
In the late 20th century, we're now 5,000 years on from that time when civilization first arose here, to be followed in Egypt and India and China. And we're still fascinated by their experience, not only by their inventiveness, but also, I suspect, by their pessimistic reading of human history, by their struggle to contain war in human life, to find a workable moral law and social order, and to preserve the earth. In our own time, we've explored space and the workings of the mind, but no more than they have we escaped that age-old contract with Mother Earth, which all so-called primitive societies take as granted. 5,000 years on, right across the world, the problems civilization faces are just the same as at its beginning. Archaic political institutions through which the few dominate the many. Unequal distribution of the fruits of the earth between rich and poor, and grossly wasteful consumption of those resources by the rich. Overpopulation, and the now stark anachronism of the sovereign independent nation-state, an idea which should surely now be consigned to the dust heap of history. The legacy of civilization, 150 generations on, is as the ancient poet of Uruk dreamed, the author of the Epic of Gilgamesh, freeing our imaginations and potentially our lives. And yet our material success is now threatening the existence of the species as a whole, and indeed of all species, whose own rights now are beginning to assert themselves alongside those much vaunted rights of man. And that's the conundrum we bequeath our children and their children in the 21st century.
The ancient Sumerians, the creators of the first civilization, told a myth about its origins. It was, they said, a devil's bargain. It offered the noblest ideals of humanity, but it also brought violence, greed, and destruction. All this is civilization, the Sumerian god of wisdom told humanity. And if you wish its benefits, you must take all its qualities. And once taken, you cannot give them back. It is for you to use them with restraint and with wisdom.
This is PBS.